Okay. The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 3 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series, Transforming Guyana. I'm Dr. Terrence Blackman, Chair and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. My co-host today is Dr. David Lewis, co-chair and fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and vice president of Manchester Trade Limited Incorporated, International Business Advisors. As is always the case, we always want to begin with the vision of the GBJ and the CPC in this context. Our vision is to provide sort of innovative and practical recommendations that advance the broad goal of a secure, open, safe, prosperous, and cohesive Guyana, in which all Guyanese, irrespective of race, class, ethnicity, or religious persuasion, share equitably in the economic prosperity of Guyana. And to this end, this series, Transforming Guyana, brings together experts and prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, and the diaspora to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We aim to offer a nuanced look at the opportunities positive impacts of the oil revenues on Guyana's people, while mitigating the risks that other countries face. And since we are part of the diaspora, to identify the promising roles that the diaspora can play in this transition. So today we're joined by Dr. Lorraine Sobers, a lecturer in the Department of Chemical Engineering, Petroleum Studies Unit at the University of West Indies, and Professor Ivelaw Griffith, the former Vice Chancellor at the University of Guyana. We were supposed to have been joined also by Dr. Ulrich Trotz and by former Vice President Sidney Allicock. Unfortunately, both of these gentlemen are not able to join us today, and we wish them well. Let me take this moment to invite Dr. Lewis to bring a few words of welcome from the Caribbean Policy Consortium. David?
Thank you, Terrence. Good morning. Good morning, Ivelaw. Good morning, Lorraine. And to all our listeners and viewers in Guyana, in the United States, in the diaspora, and across the world. First and foremost, all the best for Sidney and Ulrich. And we look forward to maybe doing a rain check with them in the future. And also thanks to Lorraine and Ivelaw as founding fellows of the Caribbean Policy Consortium joining us today. I'll just make a few quick comments, which I'm sure will be integrated into many of the discussions from the presentations during today's webinar. First, I think one of the issues we've been focusing on since we started over a year ago is the notion of the oil and gas growth and economy in Guyana as another tool and resource for Guyana's economic development for the betterment of all Guyanese. And really, as we've been seeing from the initiatives in Guyana, as a means to an end, the end being not Guyana becoming a total fossil fuel economy into the future, but to use the resources from oil and gas to build up on all the other sectors in the economy, and also to prepare for a non-oil and gas future, not only in Guyana, but in the world, with the low carbon strategy, with initiatives regarding carbon credits, carbon capture, and of course, the entire challenge, which for Guyana and the Caribbean island states is even more pressing than for the rest of the world, on climate change mitigation. And one of the issues I think that's coming up to the forefront more and more is the need for using this new tool, this new resource, these means to an end for the rebuilding of the Guyanese infrastructure, of its cities away from water and away from the environmental and climate change dangers and degradation which are upon Guyana now, not in the future, not by 2030 or any of these big landmark dates now. And as we'll hear from our presenters today, we'll see what that is meaning and the need to really put more pressure and more speed on this sort of dual action transformation of the growth of oil and gas as a means to an end in terms of resources and tools, and the shifting into that low carbon strategy, that environmentally focused future, renewable energies, and the mitigation on climate change issues. So I'll just keep it there. I'm really appreciative of Ivlo and Lorraine for joining us today, and they've got some very interesting, thought and action provoking presentations for us today. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And so, today's program is around the challenges of oil production in Guyana brings significant economic opportunities and revenue potential. But it also poses several environmental challenges that need to be carefully addressed. And so, as the country embarks on its oil production journey, it's critical to consider and to mitigate these challenges to ensure sustainable development and safeguard the environment. I precisely sustainable development and safeguarding the environment. And so Ulrich's presentation was to he was kind of going to discuss for us the potential environmental challenges associated with oil production and highlight the importance of broadly environmental stewardship in this context. And then he would have shared some studies, examples of environmental issues faced in other oil producing countries. And so what I will do is he sent us slides. And so I will simply just share three of his slides as a way of setting the stage for the potential environmental challenges that are associated with oil production. And so, as you see there, the loss of access and disturbance of other marine resource users, emissions discharges from well test operations, reduced water discharges, burning and flaring, noise and light impact on animals and ecosystems that are really deep on the ocean floor, the effect of vessel and helicopter movements on humans and wildlife, air emissions, wastewater discharges, solid and liquid waste management with specific attention to kind of the shore-based disposal of potentially radioactive waste, noise pollution, including underwater, and obviously the potential for oil spills. And so what I've laid out is sort of, as Ulrich sees it, a set of challenges that we can expect in this context, and then we have to think about how we manage them. Right? And so he's laid out for us some slides on environmental management. And perhaps what I will do, I won't detail the slides here, but what I will do is I will share these slides on our website so that folks can kind of see the entirety of the presentation. But what and my hope is that Professor Griffith will lead us in this direction, give us a sense of, as he sees it, as he looks down the road for Guyana, what are some of the things that we really ought to be taking very, very seriously? Professor Griffith.
Thank you, Terence and David, and good to see you again, Lorraine. I've spent a number of decades focusing on national and international security issues. And colleagues in the audience may recall that at the end of World War II, there were a number of reorganizations and reconfigurations of security establishments across the world. In the United States, there was the establishment in 1947. Next slide, please. 1947 of the Department of Defense. And over the years since the Department of Defense was established in 1947, there have been a number of outstanding secretaries of defense. But I want to refer to one gentleman, Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld created history in being the youngest ever Secretary of Defense, and decades later came back to be the oldest ever Secretary of Defense. Perhaps he is best known for presiding over the invasion of Iraq. And I wanted to share something that he said during that invasion when he used to offer weekly briefings, what he called media briefings. He created some consternation on February 12th when, in response to a question that he really couldn't answer, he offered a formulation that I want to use as an epigraph for my contribution this morning. He said, there are known knowns, things that we know. But there are also known unknowns, things that we know we don't know. Move to the next slide, please, Terence. And so what I'd like to do is invoke Rumsfeld and offer some of what are known knowns about Guyana in the context of climate change. I'll refer to one of the known unknowns also. And for me, when you put the whole package of known knowns and known unknowns in the climate change context, there's a fierce urgency of now that we've got the oil industry booming and going to be ramping up to great levels. It's necessary to begin to consider seriously relocating the capital city called Georgetown. So let's move to the next slide. And perhaps we can begin with the first, what I call known one. I did a study a couple of years for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I defined Guyana as being part of a wet neighborhood. I explained the very tenuous geographic and environmental realities of Guyana and of Suriname and of French Guyana, which makes it important to keep in mind as we do everything developmental and industry-oriented, that we are in a wet neighborhood. It's no accident that we are called the land of many waters. A known is that this land of many waters has 965 miles of navigable rivers. We know of the wonderful waterfalls, Kaieteur, Orunduk, and others, but there are over 250 waterfalls in Guyana. Part of this wet neighborhood is a number of falls, rivers, enabling the society to be what it is, for good and sometimes not so good. But the reality of Guyana, also in the context of wetness, is that we are part of Guyana's shield. We are part of the Amazon. Indeed, Guyana is 87% forest covered. And so with that forest covering part of the Guyana shield, part of the Amazon, there's a significant amount of rainfall that is generated in Guyana. This wet neighborhood feature has the waters in very many manifestations: rivers, waterfalls, flooding. Next slide, please. But perhaps we should bear in mind that there is also a known about Guyana, and I call it a locational vulnerability in relation to Georgetown and most of the population. We know that about 80% of the population of Guyana lives in coastal cities and villages and towns. We know that part of the vulnerability of the coast and of the country is this 285-mile-long Atlantic coastline, parts of which are up to 6 feet below sea level in some places. It's also a known that the seawall, where lots of social and cultural and other things have occurred over the decades, has not been properly maintained ever since it was built in 1855. We know that several efforts have been made over the years to enable the mangroves to be part of that protection. But even then, mangrove restoration is an area that much needs attention. So when you put the combination of the heavy rainfall, and you put it together with the raging Atlantic Ocean, and you can see from two of the pictures I have to the right, the manifestations of that rage sometimes reveal in the water slashing over the Atlantic or over the seawall. We're talking about a very tenuous and vulnerable part of Guyana. Next slide, please. But there is a view, scientifically based, which I think it's important to keep in mind as part of the known of Guyana's environment. And I decided to use just a few sentences from a 2011 Union of Concerned Scientists report about Guyana in their Climate Hot Map. This is what that report said about Guyana. The Guyana coast is subsiding owing to groundwater extraction, soil compaction, and the drainage of wetlands. From 1951 to 1979, sea level of Guyana rose at a rate 6 times the global average, around 6 times the 20th century average, or 3 times the 1993 to 2009 average. So it's not only casual observation of some of the known realities of Guyana's environment that have been established. There was a scientific basis for concern, painting the portrait of the wetness that I think we ought to be mindful as we go further along the oil and gas journey. But let's move to the next slide. And the next slide suggests, and I use only 2 sentences from an internal, very respected, very comprehensive National Land Use Plan of 2013, done by the Guyana Lands and Surveys Commission. Here is what is mentioned in that plan. You can find it online. By 2030, flooding has been estimated to cost $150 million annually. And extreme events such as the flooding of 2005 that resulted in losses equivalent to 60% of the country's GDP could result in $0.8 billion in losses and affect 320,000 people. This was what was forecast a decade ago. But here is where there is a sobering note in that report. And these 2 sentences are from the first page of that report. The need to identify and develop land away from the coastal plain has been included in the low carbon development strategy as hinterland adaptation measures to be undertaken between 2012 and 2015. Now we passed 2015. One wonders what is the result of these hinterland adaptation measures. Next slide, please. There's an organization based in New Jersey called Climate Central. It's a group of advocates and scientists for climate change issues. And they periodically do a study of cities in countries that are in trouble, likely to be in greater trouble with climate change and rising sea levels. And in 2021, they produced a report that was revised early this year. The initial report identified 9 countries, 9 cities that are likely to be underwater partially or fully by 2030. They revised that study early this year, and they've identified 15 cities likely to be in trouble by 2030. Guyana's Georgetown has a dubious distinction of being the only Caribbean city, matter of fact, the only South American city on that list. And 2030 is not very far off. But let's go to the next slide. Well, as a known 3, the reality is that the oil exploration and production in Guyana is offshore. So cynics may say, well, what's the big deal? It's offshore drilling. How can we be affected? I say to us and to those cynics, yes, the rising waters and other indicators of climate change will disrupt normal political economic life in the land, not just offshore, minimal effect. So the fact that it may be only offshore drilling and exploration should not allow us to be comforted and take slow and minimal action in dealing with our environmental security. I think the reality is environmental security of the country has been compromised for a while, and all indications are the compromise will increase. In other words, Guyana's leaders need to face the reality of an existential imperative to do something in regard to the rising sea level and the climate change realities in the context of the oil industry taking off. Next slide. And so I say that for me, a known 4 that also has elements of some known unknowns is the necessity for what I recommend as an environmental security plan with short and long-term components. Short-term components looking at sea defense enhancement, repairs, revetment, rehabilitation of the seawall in parts that have been neglected for a while, strengthening the mangrove forest restoration projects, and long-term, Guyana's capital city has got to be considered for relocation. Can the society by itself internally do this all by itself? Absolutely not. Foreign assistance is not only needed, but foreign assistance is available in the context of climate change vicissitudes across the world. Climate financing will be necessary. But Guyana has also got to be prepared to put its money where its mouth is. In other words, be prepared to put some skin in the game, put some money in the whole relocation project, researching it, implementing it. You may ask, well, go to the next slide, please. You may ask, well, where do we get some of that skin in the game money? I say use some of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. The current report of the Sovereign Wealth Fund is available publicly on the Bank of Guyana website. And I took a look at the second quarter report, which is there on the screen. You can see all the way to the bottom that the price of oil has declined between the end of March and the end of June. But you'll also notice that the inflows have been significant over that period, and that the profit has also been significant. And we are only in the beginning stages. The Sovereign Wealth Fund was created in 2019 and then revised in 2021. So where there's a good trajectory of building up some financial resources And I say, if your society is facing an existential issue, you've got to see where your own skin in the game resources can be available from. And in the country of Guyana, my recommendation is that the Sovereign Wealth Fund offers an opportunity to put skin in the game. Next slide. While I served at University of Guyana as Vice Chancellor, I inaugurated a lecture series to recognize one of our outstanding social scientists, C.Y. Thomas. And we brought down Jay Mandel, a long-standing colleague of CY, a distinguished economist. He was then at Colgate, he's retired. And Jay did an outstanding lecture on the issue. And I wanted to share just 2 sentences from that caution, that warning that Jay Mandel issued in 2016 October, and that lecture. Without a society-wide dialogue on climate change, the opportunity to forge a consensus on how to use petroleum revenues in responding to coastal flooding will be lost. And here is a sobering sentence. The risk of such a failure is that when circumstances do finally force a society to relocate, it will be unprepared to do so in any orderly and systematic way. I offer Jay's caution alarm note as I end and I move to the next slide, Terence, to say that hopefully my suggestion of some known knowns, elements of known unknowns, might help influence thinking in and around Guyana, that while climate change mitigation takes very many forms, and I applaud the establishment of Silica City that's on the way, Silica City will not suffice in dealing with the environmental climate change issues staring at us. And for me, the conversation needs to begin in earnest about relocating Georgetown as the capital. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ivla. That's a fairly sobering thought about how you relocate, and that is definitely something for discussion. As you have sort of outlined, these questions of, sort of the deep existential threat that emerges from the climate change. There is also, in a sense, where one wants to think, are there some things that we can do? Are there some practices that are sustainable? Are there some technologies that we can deploy so as to minimize the ongoing environmental impact? Some of the ideas like carbon capture technologies and reducing the carbon footprint, etc. And so I know that Lorraine has done sort of work in this area, and I wanted to invite her to broadly give us some thoughts about how we might proceed in that direction. Lorraine? And let me find your slides.
Hey, good morning, and thank you for having me. Today I'll be addressing 2 aspects of environmental stewardship, and I would continue with some sobering thoughts, in addition to being last name Sobers, some more thoughts that we're going to have, and I'm going to talk about oil spills, because I think that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think about environmental stewardship, especially with oil production. And then I will deal with the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what I'm going to deal with today. Now, with the oil spills, I'm not going to get into the usual, photos of birds needed to be cleaned up and showed. I think that has been stuck in our minds since the Macondo incident, that's in the Gulf of Mexico, and a few others. And for some of the younger generation, that is their image of the oil sector. And I say that because on the education side, I could see the response to that being that there are some young people who do not want to enter the industry, but the industry needs people who can be responsible environmental stewards. Now, I'm hearing a lot in the press, and I brought up this because it was just in June that the guarantees for oil spill liability came through, and I'll quote that properly later on. So I wanted to address that. And what I want to put forward today is a regional outlook to this. There's a lot of Guyana doesn't have this, and this one doesn't have that. And what I want to bring forward that it's not only what Guyana can do, but also what happens in the region. And so oil spills and so on has been a risk um, for all of the countries that you see there, because there has been shipping lanes and so on that where they carry large volumes of oil. So that risk has always been there. And so since 1983, there has been the Cartagena Convention, and that the full name for that is the Convention for the Protection and Development of Marine Environment of the Wider Caribbean. And here you have the countries that are part of that. And then there's the oil spills protocol. So we're talking about best practices, and one of the best practices is to have protocols across the region, because in the instance of an oil spill, it's not the oil is not going to be like, oh, this was produced in this block offshore Guyana, so it's only going to stay there, or and vice versa for the neighbors that are producing, like Venezuela and in the future probably Suriname. It depends on which way the wind blows, which way the water currents move, and so on, that you can have damage outside of your zone, right? So it means that there has to be a cooperative way of thinking, and I believe that there is, but I feel that you're not hearing about it in the press. It seems as if Guyana has to deal with this massive potential on its own, or just Guyana and the operators, right? So the objective of this is to strengthen national and regional preparedness and response. So there's a role to play in preparation. There's been training that has gone on in Ghana. I believe in 2019, training was carried out. And that type of training would fall under the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan, and that will deal with small spills. So it's not expected that in Guyana there will be all the equipment, all the material, all the expertise on hand immediately. That's not the way it goes. The preparedness and the response is spread across the country. The companies, and even the companies have their cooperatives to deal with these issues, and the region. The protocol is also to facilitate cooperation and mutual assistance in cases of emergency to prevent and control major oil spill incidents. And for the man in the street, you can think of it as having an outbreak of fire at your home, God forbid. But there are things that you would have to do to prevent that, electrical fires, doing the safe things, that you need to do. But in case of that, your neighbors would help, you would have some regional help from the fire appliances and the fire station and so on. So think of it like that. And so this is what this slide puts together. The National Oil Spill Contingency Plan action is focused. The action part would be for small spills. Of course, if there's anything bigger, it concerns the national plan. The action will come for small spills, and you're looking at less than 700 barrels. No, less than 50 barrels. That's less than 50 barrels. And then as it gets bigger and bigger, then you call in the Caribbean plan, right? And then the industrial response. Now, I would go on to how that industrial response and how that national plan could look like, and using Trinidad and Tobago as an example. So under Trinidad and Tobago's National Oil Spill Contingency Plan, there is, within the plan, there must be some acquisition and deployment of surveillance and monitoring technologies, right? So that is something that would have to be done on the ground nationally, and training that would have to be done on the ground nationally. And so we see what we see in the news recently with Guyana is the focus on the money behind it. Now, you do need money behind it, and that is what I'm saying today, is that's just part of it. So there's environmental liability insurance, there are company assets, and then what they were able to get was also a parent company guarantee, so that the US $2 billion oil spill guarantee from the operators of the Starbucks box, that has come true. He went through the court, and you all know the full story about that. And so when we come to some of the technologies, this is what they've done in the Trinidad and Tobago side. So we're not talking about the insurance anymore. We're talking about the technologies. Under their plan, for any big spills, deep water drilling operators, which would be the case for Guyana, they have to demonstrate that they have accessibility to containment cap system to arrest any subsea blowout. Now, I believe in Guyana, they've already dealt with that, so that's great. And the thing is, when we look at a national plan, I'm using Trinidad and Tobago as an example, but Guyana's plan would have to sue Guyana, of course. Guyana would have a whole different setup. Remember, with Trinidad and Tobago, we have pipelines to transport oil for Guyana at this stage is the FPSOs. And the volumes for Guyana will be much greater. So then the technologies that would be used would be different because you have to deal with a greater risk. One of the things that they would have to have availability of an additional rig to drill a relief well. You have to see is that applicable for the volumes that Guyana will be producing. And then also have remote operated vehicles in country, support vessels to transport and deploy this equipment, and access to vessels for firefighting in the event of fire explosion. Now, this is for Trinidad and Tobago. Um, they have operations that are closer to shore, and they also have those that are the deep waters. So you have to consider the location, the volumes, and also the means of transportation for oil and gas and the full picture. But this is just giving you an idea of the kinds of rules that are set in place for the operators, okay? For the operators. And this is part of their national plan, is stipulating what operators need to do. One of the things I want to point out here, I don't think I said it out loud, is that the operators need to be part of regional or international oil spill cooperatives. And so the oil spill cooperative, as the term sounds, basically they have membership that they pay into, and they maintain that membership. If anything happens, they look to this cooperative for those equipments and for the materials that are needed. Okay, so I hope I brought across clearly that the risk for Guyana is not something that is just what boots on the ground are able to do, but what the operators will be obligated to do. Past, the monies available, the technologies that they need to have on hand, and also that this is something that even for small spills, that Guyana can work with the rest of the Caribbean under the conventions that they've already signed up for. So those are the key learnings I want to bring forward with that. Right, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I would love to hear what the audience has to say and what they're thinking about this, and hopefully we can have a lively discussion. What I'm really an expert about, it's more the CO2 emission side, and that is also something that ties in with what Professor Griffith just spoke about with rising sea levels. So I'll just briefly give the link: greenhouse gas emissions, warming of the planet, sea level rising. Sea level rising is a serious thing, especially for small island developing states and for low-lying cities like Georgetown. The problem with that is not only water encroachment coming into land, but also contamination of fresh water. That one, for some reason, just scares me. You need fresh water, and to have that contaminated is a major problem. Now, when you come again and we're looking at this situation, everybody needs to look at what their issues are. And so I've highlighted here Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm going to talk about the CO2 response. So what I've highlighted in green are the priority technologies for mitigation. Guyana is looking at renewable energy, right, for mitigation of CO2 emissions. And then they're also looking at the forest sector. Also within the renewable energy and the energy sector, there's also fuel switching, so moving from fuel oil to using natural gas. In Suriname, their concern is efficient building design. When we come across to Trinidad and Tobago dealing with the same issue, their key sectors for mitigation is electric power generation, industry. Then we're talking mainly about the petrochemical industry in Point Lisas, where they use gas. So when gas comes to shore, and a petrochemical industry is established, you have an increase in CO2 emissions. And then transportation, right? So those are the key areas. And so when you look at your key areas, then you know what your response should be. Now, recently in Guyana, the Petroleum Activities Bill, we went through the process of review, and I believe it should have been in Parliament this week, if I'm not wrong. they put two provisions for carbon storage in Section 71 and Section 72. And I do not think Trinidad and Tobago has that as yet, even though they have incentives for carbon capture and storage. Guyana has gone ahead and put that forward in their petroleum bill, that the minister may you know award rights for carbon storage, right? And before I go further, I really should say what carbon storage is. Let me just go forward a little bit. So, carbon storage, basically, there are some fields that may not apply to Guyana. The natural gas also comes up with a bit of carbon dioxide, and so that is can be re-injected into a saline aquifer or some reservoir underground. That has been happening in the North Sea for more than 20 years. Norway. What we're more looking at is in the case of industry, when you have CO2 emissions from your activities and you take that carbon dioxide and you store it underground. It's basically waste disposal. Um, Carbon dioxide underground is something that occurs naturally in different parts of the world and is something that's been injected underground for many years, right? What is new is the volumes that would have to be injected, right? And so we need people to ensure that this technology grows and it can be implemented safely, right? So for Trinidad and Tobago, they have stated their objectives for carbon capture and storage. So you capture the carbon dioxide, you transport it to an injection site. An injection site would be a depleted oil reservoir, depleted gas reservoir, or saline, meaning saltwater aquifer. And their focus has been on increasing their oil production and reducing their CO2 emissions, right? Because they have a lot of heavy oil. On the United Kingdom side now, they have industries that are asking for carbon storage based on some of the legislation that they have coming forward regarding the carbon intensity of the products that they produce. They also want to reduce their carbon emissions, and they want to protect, and this is to quote the head of the I think it's NTSA, North Sea NSPCA. Sorry, I'm bad with acronyms, but they want to protect the viability and competitiveness of British industry because the carbon intensity within each product is being compared to other countries in the EU, and it affects the taxes that are put on those products. So that's what they mean when they look at the viability of the competitiveness of British industry. And also they want to facilitate the creation of many thousands of highly skilled jobs. Now, I wish that was one of the objectives within Trinidad and Tobago. And so within my sphere, that is what I am going to work to do, right? Because there are jobs available for this. And so from my experience, what we need to do for carbon dioxide storage, at this stage, the main thing is to raise awareness of the technology. And so by the time it becomes applicable to Guyana for practice, that people would know what it is about and what the risks are. And so we're not waiting until it becomes controversial and then we have misinformation and misunderstandings going forward. So my approach, and this is part of it, is to talk to a wide range of people. Now, there is a conference coming up in Guyana, I believe it's the end of this month, by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and they're going to be talking about a wide range of things. So this is usually where I would present my work. But I found over time that you need to go a bit broader. I can't just speak to the engineers and the geoscientists. I need to speak to the economists because it's something that affects the economy and they have to understand carbon capture and storage. The historians and the social sciences, because then it helps in context the technology. Technology is just not a standalone thing that you apply. It affects, the society as a whole. And so I did a book chapter on that and I put it in the context of the region, what Trinidad and Tobago is doing. And then I even spoke about how it fits in as a project because it's something that needs to be integrated with midstream, upstream, midstream, downstream, right? So it's not just one company, it's several companies would need to come together to make this happen. What else? So that was a multi-sectoral approach, raising awareness. And then going back to the oil spill and even this research and development is important because I keep raising the point. We have to look at specifically what challenges, what is key for Guyana, right? So it's not a copy and paste from anywhere. And so there is scope for research and development, and that's what I do, working at the University of the West Indies. And so there's research needed for how you're going to transport this carbon dioxide, how you're going to store it specifically for Guyana's geology, specifically for the location, specifically for the way Guyana's oil industry is shaped, how the CO2 could be utilized if we have CO2 being produced when gas comes to shore. And then if there's any prospective areas, that's what academia do. We look forward to see how things could work. So that's all I have. And my main takeaway is that as much as Guyana has these challenges, it's not something that they need to stand alone on. And there are some things that are just simply specific to Guyana and that we would have to work through for Guyana, and we can do it with a regional mindset also. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sobers. Thank you very much. I always enjoy listening. Always enjoy listening to you.
Unknown caller.
I'm sorry. I always enjoy listening to you, and as I was listening, I was trying to kind of work through, the process. Like, what are the things? And I think you sort of identified them really nice. The location, the volumes, the modes of transport, and I think that this is maybe some of the thinking that I hope we can get out there, so that when people begin to think about these problems, they kind of understand that these problems have some well-defined segments, and we have to think through how we manage these segments within the context of Guyana and its specific circumstances. David, do you want to jump in here and kind of give a thought, summing up some?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was excellent. 2 quick points, which I think we need to emphasize to people. It is clear that everything Lorraine has just laid out for us is the initial laying out of what's going to be new cutting-edge business and policy opportunities, not only in Guyana, the Caribbean, but globally. And on that list of countries that Ivlaw presented, there's some very good experiences of some of them that are top there, along with Georgetown, like Norway, like Netherlands, New Orleans, and so on. So I'm optimistic because of the wonderful best practice initiatives which are already taking place in many locations, both by public sector, governments, and civil society. So let me jump into what Terence asked me to focus on, which was really this whole issue of engagement and collaboration, community. And I'm assuming he used the word community in its larger sense of everybody that's involved, and not just the sort of traditional mantra that community is NGOs, civil society groups only, or populations here and there, but really, and particularly in a small place like Guyana, 800,000 people, as George Lamming, rest in peace, used to tease one day. I was in London and a friend said to me, "Oh, you need to look up my friend from Guyana, Kojo." And he says, "Well, what do you mean?" "Yeah, I'm sure. Just ask around for Kojo and they'll tell you where he is." That's how it happens in Guyana. That's how it happens in Trinidad. That's how it happens in St. Lucia. That's not how it happens in London, George would tease. But the point being, it's the community of everybody involved. I think first and foremost, and I believe in maybe episode 2, when we started over a year ago, I mentioned the importance and the entire industry in economics, social sciences, government, business of institutions matter and leaders matter. When we see countries, cities, businesses that have prospered, have lasted successfully for generations, the setting up of institutions and leadership that are important, that have resilience, and that plan for the future. And that requires, whether we like it or not, a system of laws and regulations to govern the participation of these institutions and the leadership with the rest of the community. And that involves expertise and preparation. Homegrown sometimes, and when we don't have it homegrown, we need to look for it elsewhere. The beauty of what Guyana has been dealing with since 2015 is that Guyana is dealing with this in the 21st century. It is not California in 1840s, the wild, wild west, which was really, really wild, wild west in terms of the whole situation of exploitation of extractive industries and so on. And therefore, we have global best practices which can be brought to bear on that large community based on merit, experience, expertise, training, research and development, and the involvement, unlike in the 19th and early 20th century, of everybody that is affected as stakeholders, and not driven by political or ideological interests, which has usually been the problem in many developing countries in this situation. So, key bottom line, and this is my own personal individual training, organizational systems and procedures are needed. In Guyana, as I've mentioned also since year one, this is work in progress. It is starting, and we need to focus on that more proactively, less recriminatory. There are too many recriminatory agendas in Guyana which really go beyond oil and gas and have come to the forefront because of the oil and gas boom and are being brought as all of Guyana's colonial and post-colonial ills and challenges. And that will not lead us to those organizational systems and procedures, institutions and leaders that I've been mentioning earlier on. Civil society organizations, geographic communities, not just the government, not just the organized political parties, but basically people coming together, sharing their views, their perspectives at the location. In Guyana, as the geographic lecture that we got from Ivlo, that is a major challenge because you just say the hinterland, but I remember in my first trip to the hinterland in 1982, and then when I took a US investment mission of all these, propped up men with suits and so on, and we took them up the Rupuruni, then you realize, man, we have a serious infrastructure access challenge that needs to be overcome in order to take advantage of what the hinterland offers. So kudos to Ivlo on that. And yes, the Silica City initiative is a good start. We probably need about 12 more minimum of them because of the size of that hinterland in Guyana. I think it's important also that we realize that in some of these best practices cases that we're seeing in other countries, Netherlands, of course, because it is almost a mirror image of Georgetown and Guyana because of the low-lying sea levels, just like Suriname, is business has been leading the way. Technology has been leading the way in many of these places in terms of this environmental change global challenge. We need to match that with parallel government public policy capabilities. And that is really the big challenge, particularly in a country like Guyana, where there's such a strain on qualified resources and skills. So just to end on that, the importance of beginning to focus on best practice experiences which exist in the region and outside, and starting to bring that to bear on what Guyana needs to do, not in 2030, not in 2050, tomorrow, right now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Your comments triggered for me something. I want to ask Ivla to come back in. So I was thinking about the last slide that he shared with us, the comments of Jay Mandel asking for something that would drive the consensus. And as I listened to you, I'm thinking, Professor, Good, comment on, as you see it, what drives the consensus for that kind of intricate dance between the oil production, the environmental stewardship? what as you see it can kind of, David talks about these institutions, but there's something else that we need to get to that can kind of harmonize these seemingly conflicted interests and communities. David kind of alluded to it in his kind of recriminatory remark. But so I wanted to give you, as the sort of dean here, the wise one here, the elder here, a thought on how should the road unfold.
Terence, just a quickie. Jay's wording was orderly and systematic manner. I would now add your third point, harmonized. I think we need orderly, systematic, and harmonized manner for that engagement. Ivlo, go ahead.
Every society has some harsh realities with which it deals. And a harsh reality of Guyana, even outside of oil, the advent of oil, is a propensity for tension based on political and racial issues. So I think we need to, as a first step, accept we're talking about a tendency not to be consensual because of legacies. And it's not important to drum up the legacies, the history, but ignoring them wouldn't help. There's a concept of planned chaos in management and in security studies. I think leadership and citizenry of Guyana need to accept that this is going to be a tense period for the nation going forward. And one of the ways to minimize and manage the tension is to practice inclusiveness at all times. As David was talking, I was reminding myself of something that one of Guyana's distinguished poets, Martin Carter. I used Martin Carter's work, a 1955 poem he had, and I want to share, and I'll probably write something that makes the point a little more powerfully. He wrote a poem called You Are Involved in the 1950s. This I have learned, today a speck, tomorrow a hero. Hero or monster, you are consumed. Like a jig shakes the loom, like a web is spun a pattern, all are involved, all are consumed. If we don't have an acceptance that irrespective of race, color, economics, this is an environment that will, if we don't get it right, consume all of us, accept that we've got to be inclusive in capturing the views, sentiments of all. So I think setting the tone is important in going forward. Whether the conversation is about low carbon development strategy or about relocating the society's capital, a tone set that is not a tone only set by the political elites, but a tone of inclusiveness and harmony set by the civic and corporate elites and the diaspora. So for me, tone is important. For me, accepting we've got a challenge, a conflictful inclination challenge, and managing that conflictful inclination challenge is important. It hasn't helped that over the last few years, political contestation issues. But the reality is, in a democracy, you're going to always have political contestation issues. So whether it's the next set of national elections or the next round of local government elections, setting the tone for peace and harmony, I think, is important. And having stakeholders from outside of society can help to set the tone. It doesn't have to be just the diaspora. There are stakeholders in Guyana's future and Guyana's business, from the United States to European countries to other countries, in Asia, have them be part of setting the tone for harmony, recognizing that unless all are involved, all will be consumed.
Dr. Griffith, on that note, I have a hard stop at 5:30 today, and I feel like I don't want to say anything else beyond what you just said right there. I want to just take this piece and have us reflect on the nature of the tone, this kind of inclusiveness that is reflexive, that helps to manage the sort of conflictual challenge that we face. And I think I will give two last words to Dr. Sobers and then to Dr. Lewis. Dr. Sobers, how do you see this unfolding as the technical one in the group? But I think sometimes the technical needs, in order for the technical to be to make its contribution, it has to have a context. And so I think Dr. Griffith just gave us a kind of good marching order. You're muted.
Yes, one of my neighbors came up to me and said, engineering is about people, and sometimes people forget that what we do to bring oil to the surface and to bring gas to the surface, it's to really make lives better for people, not worse, right? But with that being said, there's still some risk to it. And so we have to have technical solutions to that. So the underpinning for that is that what we do is for people to make their lives better, right? And that includes the actual action and mitigating the risk. And that is what we use technology for. And that is what we do research for. So it has to have the mindset of making life better for people, increasing opportunity. And I think for the younger generation, looking at the energy sector, I'm not sure how it is necessarily in Guyana, but around the world, there's this stance that they don't want to have anything to do with oil. Oil is dirty and so on and so forth. But there is room for participation of even the young ones who might see themselves as a speck, right? There's room for them. We need ideas from them. We need boots on the ground from them. We need them to do the work to answer the questions, to find all the things that we know we don't know, right? So that's the underpinning that I would bring.
Yeah. David, I'll give you the final thank you word.
Yeah, I'm just going to stick it to thank you. I think we've covered really all the issues, and we are on a hard stop today. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Professor Griffith, Dr. Sobers, yourself, Terence, and the team at GBG, along with my colleagues at the Caribbean Policy Consortium for the support with this initiative. Remind everybody that we're always on second Wednesday of every month. No matter what happens, we will be on. And episode 4 of season 2 will be next Wednesday, September 13th at 10:30 a.m. You will be receiving notices through your linkages to the Hopin, GBJ, and CPC platforms. And this is our last month of summer in this part of the hemisphere. So all of you enjoy it. We've been doing quite well with regards to hurricane season in the Caribbean, although we've been having some crazy storms in the northeast of the US, and of course, hot weather all over the world. But stay safe, be well, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Terence.
Thank you. That was excellent. Yeah, that was great.